lecture here I talk about is a little bit to give you a flavor of how research is done in ecosystem ecology. So how do we frame questions? How do we design experiments? How do we interpret our results? And then how do we express those results to, across the science society interface, right? And I think these are kind of fundamental issues that are a little bit it's sometimes difficult to get in an introductory class. We've had pretty good luck where I kind of, this is basic research that I've been involved with for the last 20 years or so. And so we get to talk about some aspects of climate change, some specific aspects of climate change, then these detailed studies and a little bit on how they're done. I'd like to have discussions as we go along. So at a couple of points, I will stop and ask for your opinions about things. And the Zoom format actually is pretty good for that, because we can, people sometimes, you're perfectly, to me, it's perfectly fine if you want to unmute yourself and then shout out a question, that's fine. But the chat feature, I have been having really a lot of fun with people using the chat feature, because if you're shy about asking questions, the chat feature is good. So feel free to type in the chat feature, that doesn't make any sense to me, or I think that's ridiculous, and then we can have a little bit of discussion about that. So feel free to either shout out or chat out as I'm going along, or at a certain couple of points I'll stop and talk a little bit. I see, so Sophie Balla has raised her hand. What do you have a question or a comment?
Maybe they still had it.
Yeah, sorry, I think that was from earlier.
Oh, okay, okay. Because so anyway, yeah, just raise your hand or shout out a question. So I am going to try and convince you in the next 50 minutes or so that snow is good, that worms are bad. And so what am I going to cover, right? So first I'm going to cover the idea of ecosystem services. Have you all had an introduction to the idea of ecosystem services?
A little bit, just yeah, actually last time we talked about biodiversity and ecosystem services there, yeah. Okay,
so I'll talk a little bit, I'll go back to ecosystem services a little bit, and then talk about how we think about ecosystem services in forests, and then talk a little bit about these two studies that I've been involved with, one involving snow and winter climate change, and one involving invasive earthworms. Okay, so this idea of ecosystem services, and I don't know if you've seen this this figure before from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but so I have actually, I guess I should introduce myself. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences, which I got a long time ago. In 1980, I got my undergraduate degree, and this was the very early years. Like environmental studies and environmental science, these degrees are pretty recent. It's not like chemistry or biology. I don't know if you've ever been, but you notice that the American Chemical Society was founded at NYU. And if you wander around, I think it's in the Brown building to the chemistry office, there's a little sign that says the American Chemistry Society was founded at NYU in 100 years ago or something like that. Environmental science degrees and environmental studies degrees are even more recent than that. And so when I started in environmental science in the 70s, we were really wrestling with what is the value of nature, right? So we know that forests are important, and we know that trees are important, and we know that the lakes and things are important, but we've always had trouble quantifying that, and this becomes very important for decision making, because let's say I have a forest somewhere, and I own this land forest, and I want to build a strip mall. I think it's somewhere in the U.S. Constitution that every American has a right to be within 3 miles of a Dunkin' Donuts, a CVS, and a bank branch. Seems that way sometimes if you're outside the city. And so I'm going to cut the forest down, and I'm going to build a Dunkin' Donuts, and I'm going to build a CVS, some type of pharmacy, and some type of that. But then people say, well, wait a second, you're going to cut the forest down, and don't we need that forest? And I say, well, yeah, the forest is nice, but what's it worth? And this has been the conundrum in environmental sciences from the very beginning. What is nature's price? What is nature's value? And how can we use nature's value to help us make better decisions about managing the environment? And this plays out at very small scales. When we think about, okay, I have a forest plot, and I would like to replace it with a donut shop. It plays out at larger scales. Let's say at a whole county or a town where I have I have wetlands that I want to preserve the wetlands, and what are they worth? And it plays out at the national scale, where I have national parks. It plays out at the global scale when we think about the Amazon as the lungs of the planet. And people say, well, and this is the Amazon is a classic example now, because people all over the world say, yeah, the Amazon is the lungs of the planet. It provides all these ecosystem services. But in Brazil, there's people who want to cut it down and burn it and convert it into cattle pasture. And so we're faced with this question of what is nature worth? And how can we use that value to make decisions about managing the environment? And it's important at a bunch of different scales. This is a struggle. It was a struggle in the 70s, and it's still a struggle today. But this idea of ecosystem services is the latest, and I would argue the most successful to date approach to quantifying nature's value. And the way this works is they have these ecosystem services split up into 3 different groups. So the ecosystem services are defined as the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, and they like to split it up into provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services. And I think this distinction is actually quite useful. So provisioning ecosystem services are things that we can quantify and things that we can put a dollar value on pretty easily. So if I have this forest that I want to cut down, I know that I can harvest some mushrooms in there for food. I can harvest wood and I can sell that for firewood, or I can sell it to turn it into paper. So there are some values I can really quantify that, yes, over 10 or 20 years, this forest is going to produce this amount of wood, this amount of water, this amount of fuel, and I can put a dollar value on that. So provisioning services are pretty easy, right? We have a quantitative understanding of them, and we can put a dollar value on them. So then when I say I'm gonna cut this down and build a strip mall, and I say, well, I'm going to create this number of jobs and this amount of property taxes and this amount of sales taxes, but then people can come back and say, yes, but the value of the food and the water and the wood is equal to this, and so that we can make a better decision. So that's provisioning services. The second group is regulating services. And regulating services are things that we have a good quantitative understanding of, but not necessarily an economic value. We can't put a dollar value on them. So I know that the forest is important for regulating the climate. It keeps things warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. I know that it absorbs water and protects floods. I know that it supports biodiversity, which suppresses diseases. I know that it purifies the water. And I have quantitative understanding of those ecosystem services, but the dollar value of those is trickier. Water purification, disease regulation. But again, I can come up with some quantitative arguments to say, you want to preserve this forest because it helps regulate the climate and floods and diseases. Then my third group of ecosystem services are cultural ecosystem services, which are things that are super important to people, but I don't have a quantitative understanding of them, and I don't have a dollar value that I can put on them. And the cultural ecosystem services are actually kind of, to me, the most intriguing and the most challenging, in that I've got this woodlot and it's super important to people. These cultural ecosystem services are the things that you'll find people, they'll be demonstrating in the street, or they'll build a tree house and they'll sit in the tree to prevent me from cutting it down. So these are things that, like aesthetic values, spiritual values, educational values. These aspects of nature are super important to people. They get people very upset. But we can't quantify that either. Quantify the functions that it's performing. I can't quantify the number of spiritual things that go on in a forest, and I can't put a dollar value on them. But one thing we feel is useful is, okay, so I can make this list of ecosystem services. So I can look at this woodlot, and I can make a full list of ecosystem services, some of which I have a quantitative understanding of, some of which I have a dollar value on, others which I just know are important. But if I can make that comprehensive list, it provides a platform for making better decisions about making the land use. And so I'm going to stop in a minute and ask you all if you think that ecosystem services is useful, or if it's offensive or whatever. But just one other thing I wanted to make the case of So we've made these advances and we've classified provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services. The research challenge now is exploring the links between ecosystem services and what are referred to as constituents of well-being. And so people really want to know what are the links between these different types of ecosystem services and people's personal security, the ability to provide basic material for a good life, people's health, both their physical health and their mental health, and then kind of societal health, things like social cohesion. And you can see that this is a mess, right? So I have lines, some are thick, some are thin, some are different colors. And this is a super active area of research. And I think that this is the super important area where people with degrees in environmental studies should be getting high paying and interesting jobs over the next 10 or 20 years. If we think that ecosystem services does help us to make better decisions about the environment, there's a ton of work that needs to be done to quantify those services and understand the links between those services and the different constituents of well-being. I think is what you all are being trained for now in this. So that's my little introduction to ecosystem services. I wanted to stop for a minute and see, do you all think that this is a useful approach? Do you think it's a bad approach? Like some people are quite offended by the idea of ecosystem services. And so let's have a little bit of discussion about this. And you can either just, you can raise your hand, you can just unmute yourself and talk, or you can put things in the chat. And I'll sit here for a minute and wait for people to think about this. Any thoughts about ecosystem services from anyone?
You know, without going too deeply into the into this, you know, discussion, because I know it's one that's kind of like hotly debated, I guess. This whole like system that you have here, that we've got with the ecosystem services and all of that, it's very anthropocentric, right? And I think that is sort of the non-anthropocentric part of it is sort of like kind of halfway accounted for under the cultural, you know, umbrella. But it definitely, to me, doesn't feel like that actually extends to the more biocentric things. And, you know, far be it from me to think that it's not good that we're defining things based on how useful it is to us, but, you know, we also aren't the only beings.
Yeah. So I'm very glad to hear that. And that's a very nice way of saying it, right? So some people get very upset with this. It's like, who the hell are you to decide what all these ecosystem services are? It is a very anthropocentric, and as I don't know, my grandmother used to say, you don't know every damn thing, and that is to me is an ongoing problem with ecosystem services, and I think whenever ecosystem services is presented, someone has to stand up and say that thing, because it is, you know, it's the best it's people will argue about, well, we are humans and we have a frankly human view of the world, but there are other things out there that we don't appreciate and we need to recognize. So I'm very glad you brought that up. That's a good one. Any other comments about ecosystem services? Do people think it's useful, right? So for example, you know, the question is, I'm making the case that I'm gonna cut down this forest and I'm gonna build a donut shop. Is ecosystem services really gonna help me to make that decision a little better? What do people think?
Well, I kind of think there's a difference between personal benefit and social benefit for that sort of thing, like to use your donut shop and forest example. Because say I wanted to cut down a forest and build a donut shop instead, maybe to me the personal benefits would be greater when if I had the donut shop rather than keeping the forest. Like I would make more money that way, but maybe the social benefits of keeping the forest would be higher than the economic benefits of the donut shop. So I think it's kind of difficult to say. They can be useful, but economic values can be useful, I think, in determining what things are more beneficial, but I also think they can get really easily convoluted depending on whose viewpoint it's coming from.
Yeah, I think that's also an excellent point. This idea that there's always there's different scales, right? So there's personal values and then there's societal values, and the idea with ecosystem services is definitely the trying to reconcile those two. So indeed there's the from a personal point of view, I can just, but we're supposed to have government to help us make decisions where we balance personal versus whole societal values, and that is an ongoing debate. So one thing that we would argue is there used to be this idea of businesses existing in this context of businesses had a relationship with their workers, they had a relationship with their society, they had a relationship with the government, and they used to make decisions that way. More recently, there's been a focus on business have a relationship with their shareholders, the people who own and make profits, and the balance. There's a lot of discussion about how do we have the balance between I'm a business person, what's my relationship with my workers, with my community, with my government, and with my shareholders, and those things get out of whack, and so that's also a very, very good point. Any last comments about ecosystem services before we move on? I would say, so, and again, I remember when I guess I got to, this is when I started in graduate school, but there was a book, I think it was published in '76 called Nature's Price, which was negotiating about, it was written by a Dutch guy, Hummelink. And I do think we're making some progress with this, at least you see it. So for instance, in Sweden, they have an ecosystem services law, and they have these concepts about ecosystem services are pretty strongly rooted in their decision-making processes at the town, the state, and I think even the national level. And we see it in a couple of places that this idea of ecosystem services, both the concept and then there have been some developments of it. And so I do think it's actually, we're making some progress, and I do think that there's going to be a demand for people working with this. Now for me, from my point of view, let me get this out here. Okay, so now I'm interested in ecosystem services in forests. And this is where I'm gonna use the idea of using ecosystem services as a way of helping to organize my research program. And then I'm going to give you a little sense of how we define and carry out research questions. So I work I work in forests. I work at a long-term ecological research site in the White Mountains of New Hampshire called the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. And the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest there's a cartoon showing a conceptualization of that forest in this picture, and it's a forest. We like to think about the forest and the associated aquatic ecosystems. There are streams and lakes associated with the forest, and that's the forest I study. People have been it's a long-term study site, so people have been working there since the 50s, and basically we have a bunch of people kind of staring at that forest and thinking about how do we study this? What's going on in this forest? And there's various ways to think about that forest and to frame questions. So one way is I could think about this forest in terms of ecosystem services. I can say, well, okay, what is this forest doing for me? It's and what am I interested in, right? So am I interested in the production of trees? Am I interested in the ability of this forest to produce clean water? Am I interested in the ability of the forest to produce a lot of water? I'm a biogeochemist, and so I'm really interested in these greenhouse gas fluxes and carbon storage, but I'm also interested in the ability of the forest to support biodiversity and some aesthetic values. And so if I'm a scientist and I'm interested in soil carbon storage, I can then say, okay, here's my forest, and I'm going to pose a series of questions about how soil carbon storage varies within that forest. So now if I'm interested in how soil carbon storage varies within the forest, I need to think about what are the factors that are going to control that. They're going to control variation in time and space and the ability of the forest to store carbon. And we like to make a distinction between what we call state factors that control what goes on in this box, and stochastic factors also control things that go on in the box. So let me say a little bit about state factors first. So the state factors are basically an idea that you can think about what are the really big scale, long-term factors that control what an ecosystem looks like. And one way to think about this is I could say, okay, close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you to envision a spot Just close your eyes and envision a spot, and I'll tell you something about the climate in that spot, the parent material, which is the basic rocks and soils in that place, the topography, the set of organisms that could live there, and the time, how long it's been there. So I would say, close your eyes, think about a spot, and I could say, oh, it's warm and wet, and there's this huge diversity of organisms that's been there for millions of years, and it's flat, and you could kind of envision in your head a tropical rainforest. Or I could talk, if I was thinking about Hubbard Brook, it's much younger, it's glacial, so it's only 15,000 years old, it's cold, the parent material is this nasty granite bedrock. And so the idea of state factors, it summarizes a lot of our understanding about things like biomes, which I know you've been talking a little bit about biomes. And so you get an idea of an expected state, that if I close my eyes and then I went to the spot, here's what I would expect to see. I would expect to see a sugar maple forest or a pine forest or an oak forest or something like that. But what happens, and the state factors are useful in that regard of producing an expected state for an ecosystem. But the problem is, when we go out to those spots, we frequently find, we don't find what we expect. And that some stochastic factor has come in and pushed from the bottom, kind of pushed that ecosystem away from its expected state. So maybe there has been a fire, it could be a natural fire, that burned up all the maple trees. And so where I expect a maple forest, I get an oak forest instead. Maybe there's been an insect outbreak. It could be a natural insect outbreak, or it could be an introduction of an exotic species outbreak that has come in and has pushed the ecosystems out of its state, its expected state. So I'm finding something different than what I expected. And this is a huge challenge when we study forests and when we're interested in ecosystem services, because, okay, I go back to my soil carbon storage idea. I want to manage this forest for soil carbon storage, and it matters a lot whether it's a maple forest or a pine forest. And while I might expect a maple forest, if I get a fire or an invasive species, then it's going to change that. And so I can think about state factors give me my expected state. Stochastic factors interact with the state factors to change the state, and that changes ecosystem services. And so the reason I'm spending time on this is I'm trying to introduce you to the way we think about forest ecosystems. And you can think about them a whole bunch of ways. I could think about them if I'm interested in a specific ecosystem service. I could also study them. Let's say I'm a fire ecologist, or I'm a geologist, or I'm an exotic species ecologist. And so I could be coming from this side. Well, I'm interested in insects, and so I can think about how insects are important. And then the other is I could be a state factor person. I could be thinking about global patterns of topography and climate, and so I could approach it from this side. And so there's lots of different ways about thinking about forests. The examples I'm gonna give are where we started thinking about some examples of ecosystem services. Now, so one other thing with ecosystem services is it allows you to make statements about things are good or things are bad. So let's say, again, I go back, I'm interested in soil carbon storage. And if I know that I have a forest ecosystem where there's lots of snow, long snowy winters, I get more soil carbon storage. So I can then make a statement that I say, well, snow is good, right? I've got a specific value that I'm interested, or a specific benefit. And if I get a lot of snow, I get more of that benefit, so I can say that snow is good. On the other hand, if I know that I have a forest with earthworms in it, and the earthworms reduce the amount of soil carbon storage, I can then make some kind of statement that worms are bad. And so in the rest of this talk, I'm going to try and convince you that snow is good and worms are bad. But there, again, there's another kind of warning flag about ecosystem services, and that many people are unhappy about making statements that things are good or things that are bad, especially things like earthworms, where most people think that earthworms are good, and I try and convince them that things that earthworms are bad. It makes people pay attention, and getting people to pay attention is actually quite good, because then you can engage in a discussion with them. But ultimately, and I want to get this discussion to be, okay, so here's how I think about forests, and I frame research questions. I'll talk about how we followed up on some of those research questions. But then the last thing, we want to talk about is how do we express our results to society? How do we get society to grapple with our results and to use our results? And this idea of saying that things are good and bad, it certainly gets people to pay attention. Whether it helps them to grapple with the results, I don't know. And I'll be curious to get your opinions. So does any of this make sense? If does this make sense? We're now gonna talk about these forests, and we're going to talk a little bit about the work with snow and a little bit about the work with earthworms. Any questions before I go into that? Okay. And if you think about questions, I do not mind being interrupted. Okay. So let me give a little bit of an introduction to the snow work in our climate change context. So this is the temperature, the mean annual temperature from the site, the Hubbard Brook site in New Hampshire. It's in the mountains, and so we measure the temperature at the bottom of the hill, they've been measured. The Forest Service has been measuring it there since 1955, and we measure the temperature at the top of the hill, where of course it's colder at the top of the hill than the bottom of the hill. And this is classic climate change data. So it's 50, 60 years. No, it's like almost 70 years of data now, and we can see that the mean annual temperature is going up, but it's not anything that you could perceive as an individual, right? So if I had been living at this site since I was a kid, I might think it's warmer, but I wouldn't really notice that it's so much warmer. And this is the problem we have with climate change. Is this is an inexorable climate change. It has super big effects on ecology, but it's hard to see. So one of the things that we've been interested in, we're interested in studying that, but there are many other aspects of climate change that are actually more dramatic than the increase in temperature, and they're also more dramatic in terms of people's perceptions. So here's one of my favorite ones, and this is the biggest climate change that we've seen at Hubbard Brook over the last 60 years has been the loss of extreme cold temperatures. Now, I'd like you to think about that for a second, and you can look at this graph over here, and this basically says this is the change of frequency. And how frequently does it get to minus 25 degrees C? How frequently does it get to minus 20 degrees centigrade, which is pretty damn cold? And then this graph also shows the changes in extreme high temperatures, right? So how we had big increases in super warm temperatures, like 25 degrees C, which is pretty warm. This is a complicated graph, but what it suggests is that very cold temperatures have kind of disappeared from places like Hubbard Brook. And this is very common throughout the entire Northeast. The most dramatic aspect of climate change has been the loss of very cold temperatures. And in general, climate has changed much more in the winter than it has in the summer. So again, and the key, so minus 25 is pretty cold. It used to get minus 25 like every other year at Hubbard Brook, and now doesn't get to minus 25 like maybe every 10 years or so. I live 80 miles north of New York City. It used to get to minus 25, again, every 3 to 5 years. It has not been minus 25 since, I think, 1994 over there. Now, I got a question for you guys. Is this good or is this bad, the loss of extreme cold temperatures? Anyone have any opinions about whether this is a positive aspect of climate change that's going to help people, or is this a negative aspect of climate change?
I mean, I would say negative just because I'm sure there are a lot of plant and animal species that have evolved to use and take advantage of this cold weather.
Okay, that's good. I think there's definitely something there. Any other thoughts? So we'll come back to that. Does anybody own a house over here? See, that's the other, it's interesting when we're in college, like, I don't know, I didn't own a house till I was 100 years old, but if you own a house and you have a furnace in that house, you really worry about extreme cold temperatures, right? So you think about when it gets to minus 25, your furnace in the house goes, and then it breaks, and then you have a big expensive thing. People die when it gets to minus cold, right? We have a large homeless population in New York City. When it gets to be minus 25, they send people out to kind of make sure that that people go to shelters. Really cold temperatures are dangerous, and many people, especially people who own houses with old furnaces, are like, oh, great, this is good. But there are some surprising negative impacts of super cold temperatures. So I live 80 miles north of New York City. I would like to grow bananas in my garden. Why can't I grow bananas? Anyone know why I can't grow bananas in Dutchess County near Poughkeepsie? If I put a banana plant out there, it'll grow just fine, but it will die in the winter because it gets too cold. And the extreme low temperature has a huge effect on the distribution of plants and animals. So So if I'm a banana, bananas have actually a very poor tolerance for cold temperatures. And so if it gets to if it gets to 35, the banana plant dies. But just about all plants and animals, like the big controller, the distribution of plants and animals is how cold does it get in the winter? So this plays out in a very interesting way. Has anyone been bitten by a tiger mosquito? Any tiger mosquito? Has anyone seen any tiger mosquitoes? Tiger mosquito is this Asian mosquito. It carries dengue fever and chikungunya and West Nile virus. And it's a mosquito that was introduced. It came from Asia, and it never was supposed to get to New York City. It's a tropical species. It does not like cold weather. There's no way that they ever thought that the tiger mosquito was going to live in New York City. But of course, we've lost the cold temperatures, and so now we have lots of tiger mosquitoes in New Jersey. They're in New York City. They're up in Westchester County. They overwinter. They breed there, and so we have pests that are controlled by the loss of cold temperatures. The other good example is the hemlock woolly adelgid. So I don't know if you're familiar with hemlock trees, but they're a local tree that they're beautiful trees, and they are being killed by an invasive pest, the hemlock woolly adelgid, which was introduced in Virginia sometime in the 70s. Hemlock woolly adelgid was never supposed to get to New York City. It was never supposed to get to Connecticut or Massachusetts because one night of minus 15 degrees and it kills the hemlock woolly adelgid. But it never gets to minus 15 anymore. So the hemlock woolly adelgid kind of made its way up here a couple times and it got killed back. And then it came back again a couple of years later and got killed back. And now it's coming back and it doesn't get killed. It just keeps spreading. And so now all the hemlocks in New York are dying. All the hemlocks in Connecticut are dead already. Most of the hemlocks in Massachusetts are dead because we've lost these very cold temperatures. Now I give this example just because there are lots of aspects of climate change that are surprising. Like most people, when they think about climate change, they think about, oh, it's just going to be really hot in the summer. But the way it's actually playing out is that the effects are much bigger in the winter than they are in the summer. And some of the effects are real surprising, like this loss of cold temperatures. And again, what we see in a lot of our research sites is yes, we're losing the cold temperature. We're not particularly getting more high temperatures. And so we always need to be ready for surprises. So the thing that we've been studying, that I've been involved with, is the changes in snow. And so because the climate change has been changing a lot in the winter, people have been paying attention to snow. So here's an interesting, it's a graph of changes in snow at Hubbard Brook over time. And so again, these are data since 1955, and this is the maximum snow depth has been going down. The amount of water that's stored in the snowpack has been going down, and the days of snow cover have been going down as well. And again, these are classic messy climate change data where it's a very significant decrease, but it's very difficult to perceive on a human timescale. So we're interested in these changes in snow cover. We're also interested in things that are in this picture here where we get extreme snow drought. So this picture was taken in February, and in February there ought to be about a meter of snow on the ground here. And you can see this stick should be covered up or just about covered up with snow. But what we're getting is a bunch of years where you get into January or February and there's no snow cover, and then it gets really cold. And so then the soil freezes because it doesn't have the insulating blanket of snow. So we've been interested in these long-term changes in snow, and then we've been also interested in the snow drought. And the problem, of course, is these extreme freeze events. So my forest doesn't have its snow cover. I get a cold outbreak, and then everything freezes. You know, if I have a picture of that, no, I don't have a picture of that. So what we're interested in, again, these odd aspects of climate change is just the long, inexorable change in snow, but then we're interested in these extreme events where the lack of snow makes the soil vulnerable to soil freezing. And so that's where we're going to talk about snow as good. The effect of snow as an insulating blanket. I just wanted to give you one more thought about climate change before we go on. So you look at these days of snow cover, right? So I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, and for us, it was a big thrill to go ski at Mount Snow in southern Vermont. And And so sometimes we could go skiing at Mount Snow. Sometimes in December, or in March, they were open. Sometimes they just didn't have any snow. Winter's a lot warmer. There's a lot less snow cover. Is Mount Snow open more or less than it used to be? Like, is there, people worry about the ski industry. How has the ski industry been affected by this? What do you think? Any thoughts? Is there more days of skiing at Mount Snow now or less?
I'm pretty sure there's
probably less.
There ought to be less, but there's not. There's actually a ton more. Mount Snow is open many, many more days than it used to be when I was a kid. And why is that?
I know. Yeah.
What was that?
snowmaking.
Snowmaking, right? So when I was a kid, I'm an old person, right? So when I was a kid, snowmaking had just started, right? And it was terrible. I don't know if you've ever seen old-fashioned snowmaking, but they would kind of blow these ice pellets at you while you're skiing down the slope. And they've gotten really much better at snowmaking. It's a classic example of adaptation to climate change. Right now, as ecologists, we don't necessarily like to talk about adaptation to climate change. We mostly would like to get people aware of the negative effects of climate change and get them to stop causing climate change. But at the same time, the ski areas are trying to make a living, and they have been working very hard and very effectively to adapt to climate change. And it's a really interesting. I'm trying to think a lot about the interface between science and society, and we talk a lot with the ski areas, right? So we work in New Hampshire where there are a lot of ski areas, and we talk with them about our climate change results, and they like us and they hate us all at the same time. Because a lot of times there'll be a newspaper article and this new science suggests that the ski industry is threatened. And so the ski area operators will say to us, it's nice that you're concerned about this, but when you make a big fuss about this, it's killing our industry, right? So let's say I'm thinking about buying a season's pass to ski at Mount Snow, or I'm thinking about buying some new ski equipment, and then there's a new article saying, oh, the ski industry is dying. People are like, well, maybe I won't buy new skis, or maybe I won't buy a season's pass. And as a scientist who's very interested in that flow of information from science to society, I learn things when I talk to people who are affected by climate change. And sometimes I realize that my messaging is not necessarily helping them as much. And so that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about this adaptation. The other adaptation is, I don't know if you've seen this, but you can make a snow person, right? You roll up a ball, you make a snowman or a snow woman. And now people don't do that anymore. They buy these plastic inflatable ones. That's another example of adaptation to climate change, right? If it's not going to snow and I can't make a snow person, I'm gonna buy a plastic one. And I'm impressed with the ski area adaptation a little more than I'm impressed with the plastic blow up snow people, but that's an aesthetic choice there. Okay, so let me go on and I'm going to run out of time. So just let me talk a little bit about, we are interested in the change in snow, and we're particularly interested in these snow droughts, these years when we really don't get much snow and the soil freezes. And so the idea that we've been following is that snow is very important as an insulator of the forest floor, of the forest soil. And when you don't have snow, it creates a vulnerability. So maybe it's a warm winter, but I'm going to get an outbreak of cold air. And if I don't have snow, the soil is going to freeze. And soil freezing is actually a huge stress on soil. So in most years, if you go up into the woods in New Hampshire or Vermont, the soil is not frozen. There's this blanket of snow, and underneath the snow, the soil is sitting at around 1 degree C, and the roots are alive, and the insects are alive, the microorganisms are alive, and there's a lot of biological activity going on under the snow. But if the soil is sitting there kind of bare, it's going to freeze up, and it's going to. We were concerned that we had a hypothesis that it was going to kill roots, it was going to kill biological activity in the soil and cause big changes in the soil, resulting in nutrient loss. Basically, nutrients were going to come washing out of the system. And so that was our big idea. And we wanted to study this, and this is just another about how research is done in environmental science. So this is a complex question, and in order to study this, it can't be just one person working by themselves. So in order to study this, you had to assemble a big. I'm going to skip this a little bit. Time. but we had to have okay, so you had to have a big group of people to do this, right? I'll go back to this, right? So if you think about, you want to study, oh, there we go. You had to get a big group of people to study this. So in order to study the relationships between the depth of snow, freezing of the snow, and the nutrient loss, you needed someone who knew something about snow. So I have a snow physicist on here. You need someone who knows something about roots. You need someone who knows something about soil, something about hydrology, something about forest trees. And so you have to assemble a team of people to work together. And if you're lucky, you can get really good graduate students and postdocs and technicians to help you with the work. And then if you're lucky or so, you can get funding from research agencies like the National Science Foundation to fund your work. And so it's very important, there are these complex aspects of climate change, and in order to study them, you need a team of people to do them. And so the question is, what was our approach? How could we go about doing this, right? So you think about this is a tricky question, and so we decided to take a manipulation approach, where we set up a series of plots, 10 by 10 meter plots, and we created our own snow drought by removing the snow by shoveling. And so we simulated a snow drought by every time it snowed in December and January, we sent people out to shovel the snow out of the woods to create that vulnerability, and then hope that it would get cold enough to induce soil freezing. We were very specific about where we did these, so we were able to do controlled experiments where we did studies comparing yellow birch stands and sugar maple stands. We did another series of studies where we compared plots at the top of the hill versus plots at the bottom of the hill, so we could control the variation in soil freezing. And since we had these intensive plots, we could instrument them so we could measure the response in some detail. So we measured the temperature, we measured were the roots dying, were the microorganisms dying, we measured were the nutrients washing out of the system, we measured greenhouse gas responses as well. We produced models to simulate and extrapolate our results. So this was a plot scale experiment. And here's a picture of one of those plots. So it's a 10 meter by 10 meter plot. I had hired a couple of technicians. These were honor students, undergrads. And to get to these plots, they had to snowmobile out into the woods about 10 miles. They then had to hike another mile or so into the woods and then shovel these particular plots out. And I'm curious to know, do you all think that this is a good approach? Right, so I really want to study the effects of the loss of snow. I'm going to do it with a manipulation experiment. Do you all think that that's a decent approach for this kind of study? Are there any kind of, can you think about what the strengths and weaknesses of this approach might be? Anyone want to comment on that? Why can't I see people? I can't see people. Anyone have any problems with this approach? Anyone think it's okay or bad or good?
Kind of labor intensive, but I guess in the name of science, it's all right.
Okay, it is labor intensive. Do you think the plots are big enough? Let's see. What? There's my chat. There's a chat. Anyone? So I can, since I'm going to run out of time pretty quickly. I could wait for you all. I'm curious to think about this. So I've got this big idea about how climate change is affecting the woods, and I'm going out there with these little plots. And so sometimes people get nervous. Why can't I? My screen is doing funny things. Hold on a sec. That's not helping me. Well, I'll just have to keep anyway. So I can't see anybody now. So if you have comments or questions, you're either just gonna have to shout out or use the chat window. But so we decided to take this plot approach for these studies, and many people said they were concerned that the plots were too small. They were concerned that there was too much disturbance because we had to walk around in these plots to shovel them. People were concerned about the plots are small and they're surrounded by lots of other areas that aren't affected by the, by our treatment. And so people were worried about our experimental system. And this is something we grapple with in all kinds of science. And the example I like to use is, okay, let's say instead of studying snow effects on the forest, let's say we were interested in making a new drug, like a new, some type of, oh yeah, no, we were interested in making a new artificial sweetener. Let's say I invented a new artificial sweetener. Now, before I could use that new artificial sweetener, I would have to demonstrate, before I could sell it, I would have to demonstrate that the artificial sweetener was safe. And so how would I go about testing that if an artificial sweetener was safe? And so the ideal way to do it would be I would get 10,000 people, and I would split them into two groups. 5,000 people would get a dose of the artificial sweetener every day for 30 years. And then the other 5,000 people would be the control group, and they wouldn't get the artificial sweetener. So I would do a 30-year experiment with a huge group of people, and then after 30 years, I would know, yes, my artificial sweetener is safe. But is that how I test artificial sweeteners? No, that's not how we do it at all. We do artificial sweetener tests with rats, right? So we start with mice, and we give a little mouse a huge chunk of artificial sweetener, and we see, does it die like in the next week? We then go on to rats, which are bigger than mice. Maybe we go on to monkeys. But basically, we do a series of experiments with experimental systems like mice and rats. And I would argue in ecosystem science, this plot that I'm showing you here, this is my rat. This is my lab rat. And in any kind of science, we're always trying to use experimental systems to draw conclusions about phenomena in nature. So here, I'm using this experimental system to draw pretty broad scale conclusions about climate change. And I'm nervous about that because the plots are small, they're surrounded by, they're affected by interaction with the surrounding nature. I'm worried about the disturbance. And so I worry about that a lot. But it's just important when we think about the production of scientific knowledge, we're always struggling with how do we do, what are the experimental systems we use, and how can we draw information and conclusions from that. And this plays out particularly when I then want to go to society and make recommendations, right? So I'm not going to have time to present the data from this, but we did these studies, and we showed that when the soil freezes, everything goes to hell in these forests. I mean, the roots die, the microbes die. We have lots of nutrients washing out of the system, which is bad for the forest. We have the nutrients wash out of the system, so it affects the ecosystem services related to forest production. When the nutrients wash out of the forest, they become water pollutants, so it affects the water quality ecosystem services of the forest. And we produced a bunch of experimental data that suggested that changes in snow cover are really going to affect ecosystem services in the forest. And we published a bunch of scientific papers on that. But I wanted to go to society. I wanted to go to the governor of New Hampshire. I wanted to go to my congressperson. I wanted to go to Washington and say, the forests are dying because of climate change. The sky is falling. We need to do something about this. And then, of course, the decision makers would say, oh, okay, professor, that's very interesting. How do you know that the sky is falling? And I said, well, I paid some undergraduates to shovel the snow out of the woods on these little plots, and everything went to hell. And then they come back to me and they say, well, I don't think so. And so there's this real question about our experimental methods and how does that affect our translation of knowledge from science to society. And so what we've done, and this is just the incredible challenge with science. And so we did some of these studies. We got some results. We did, and when you go to society and you say, okay, I have these results and I think they're important and I want you to make decisions about them, you have to be very careful with your evidence. So we did lots of those plot studies. We then were nervous that the plot studies, people wouldn't believe, and so we did elevation gradient studies where we compared plots down at the bottom of the hill to plots at the top of the hill. You can see the forest looks pretty similar. The temperature is different. This was kind of like a natural experiment. And we got similar results. And we still went, and so we went to society again, and we said, now we have results from little plots, and we have results from an elevation gradient. And are you convinced of that? And they were like, well, maybe we're convinced. We also did experiments where we looked at wildlife effects, right? So one of the big things in New Hampshire is the return of moose. Moose, they browse on vegetation, which is affected by snow cover, right? So if there's a lot of snow cover, Moose cannot eat all the vegetation in the winter, and so there's a big interaction between the moose and the forest. And we studied that a little bit, and we talked about these forests being affected by the return of moose, which can eat a lot of trees. We also talked about the forest being affected by the loss of snow, which causes the frozen soil. And so if you think about like a tree, like a balsam fir, which is a northern species, which is really, we worry about it a lot with climate change, it's getting stressed from below by frozen soil. It's getting stressed from above by the moose. And is that multiple stress going to kind of push that into the abyss? And people were able to relate to that a little better. I think people maybe are more interested in moose and trees than they are in frozen soil. Maybe people relate to the idea of multiple stress. But we spent a lot of time collecting, designing experiments, producing scientific results, and then engaging with society to see, did they understand the results? Did it increase their concern about climate change? Did it increase their willingness to do something about climate change? So the snow work, again, there was a lot of detailed science where we demonstrated that winter climate change has multiple components and effects. This research is ongoing, but the basic theme is that snow is good and the loss of snow is a problem. Okay, now I have 4 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about earthworms. So again, the snow work, I have ecosystem services. You know, if you lose snow, the forests are going to be less productive. They're going to have not as clean water. They're not going to, you know, hold on to carbon. They're not going to support biodiversity. There were a bunch of negative effects of the loss of snow. With earthworms, we were asking the question about, do ecosystems that have earthworms, do they have better or worse ecosystem services than ecosystems that do have earthworms? And again, we were particularly interested in carbon sequestration and nitrogen retention and these greenhouse gases, and then also biodiversity. And the idea is that if I have earthworms, are these ecosystem services enhanced, or are they decreased by the presence of earthworms? And a lot of people thought, when I explain to people, they think that that's kind of a dumb question, because they say, well, aren't earthworms ubiquitous? I mean, why are you asking me about ecosystems that don't have earthworms? Because earthworms are everywhere. And it actually turns out that earthworms are not ubiquitous. And so this is a map. This blue line is the glacial boundary in North America. So 12,000, 15,000 years ago, glaciers came down out of the Arctic. They pushed down through Canada. They pushed down into the US. They got to central New Jersey and they stopped because they were like so appalled with New Jersey. They're like, we're not going any farther. That's actually not the case. But in any case, you had glaciers pushed down 15,000 years ago, and the idea is that glaciers killed all the earthworms because they disturbed the soil. And people had known these soil scientists had known for years that there's no earthworms north of the glacial border. So there's vast areas of northern forest in places like New Hampshire, Vermont, and Canada that they don't have earthworms. And then in other parts of the US where the glaciers weren't, there's still not, there's earthworms there, but most of them, it turns out, are not native species. So for a couple hundred years of forest soil science, people assumed that these forests didn't have earthworms. About 30 years ago, people started noticing areas that were colonized by earthworms from Europe and from Asia. And then even when people started looking in the south, they realized that, okay, there were no glaciers, but there doesn't seem to be too many native earthworms in the unglaciated parts of North America, mostly species from Europe and Asia. And this has a big effect. So forest soils have a really thick layer, a forest floor layer, in the absence of earthworms. And so we studied forest soils for years and years and years, and this is what they look like with this thick forest floor. And then in the presence of earthworms, so if earthworms come into a site, they invade a site, and in about 5 years, the forest floor is gone. And this is, again, another way about how science goes on, and that we make observations, right? So people are wandering around and they see, hey, what happened to the forest floor over here? And then people say, well, where did these earthworms come from? And so suddenly people start to ask questions about what might the effects of these earthworms be on the forest. And so again, I don't have time to go into this, but we basically made these observations. We did a whole series of studies where we determined that indeed earthworms are invading across a wide area of North America. They are having a series of negative effects on carbon in the soil and in biodiversity in the forest. And we really need to do something about this. So I'm gonna stop sharing and then go back so I can just talk to you for a second. So we did a bunch of work where we determined that worms were bad. And again, we wanted to take our results out to society and say, hey, here's something you should be concerned about. We should do something about this. And this was really interesting because again, we've been doing this for 20 years, but 20 years ago, everyone people looked at us like we were crazy because everyone knows that earthworms are these hard workers that make the soil a better place. And when you tell them, so in science, we're used to people kind of ignoring us when we tell them things. But if you tell them something that kind of contradicts with something that they kind of know in their head, they pay attention to you, but do they pay attention to you in a useful way? And so the earthworm story is another one. So in any case, I've tried to give you, what have we tried to do here? And I'm a little bit over, so I'll finish up. Tried to get you to think about some unique aspects of climate change. As climate is changing in complex ways, and it's challenging to study. And as scientists, we spend a lot of time grappling with how do we articulate questions, how do we design studies, how do we collect data, and then what do we do with that data? And how do we then share that data with society to help people make better decisions about managing the land? And that's, I think it's modern science. I think it's very much consistent with environmental system science. I think it's a lot of fun. It's very different than traditional science in the laboratory. We're not going to talk to anybody except for other scientists. I think ecosystem services, I think climate change helps us to do this more modern science, which is a little more dynamic in the interactions within science and with society. And I think it's fun.